Hello everyone, welcome back to Nuclear Engineering Lectures. Our video today concludes our nuclear waste mini-series and considers one final option for disposing of our nuclear waste, that is doing nothing. That's right, what if we did absolutely nothing with our nuclear waste and just kicked the can down the road? What if we just left nuclear waste right at the nuclear power plants where it is currently being generated? Now, on one hand, I believe that we have an obligation for disposing of nuclear waste. Our generation has enjoyed the benefits of the electricity that waste has produced, so it should only be fair that we make sure the waste is disposed of properly. But on the other hand, it turns out that doing nothing about our nuclear waste is surprisingly effective for now. The truth is that our nuclear waste is so completely safe staying right where it is now that it is sometimes actually hard to generate a conversation or to motivate folks to come up with a way for disposing of the waste. Let me explain. So what do we currently do with our nuclear waste that is generated at nuclear power plants? To recap, our nuclear waste is actually used nuclear reactor fuel, which is generally in the form of 12-foot long fuel assemblies. These assemblies are made of individual uranium dioxide ceramic fuel pellets, which are stacked on top of each other inside of zirconium metal tubes. This spent fuel is radioactive because the leftover pieces of uranium atoms that have undergone fission products, tend to be radioactive. And as long as we keep this fuel at a safe temperature and make sure that it isn't corroding or leaking out any radioactivity, then our nuclear waste is considered safe. So when a fuel assembly first leaves the nuclear reactor core, its first destination is the spent fuel pool, which looks something like this. These spent fuel pools are simply large pools of purified water where the spent fuel sits for a while when it first leaves the reactor. Now, the water in these pools serves multiple purposes. Standing next to one of these spent fuel assemblies right after it exited the reactor would give you a fatal radiation dose in roughly 20 seconds. But storing the fuel under about 20 feet of water reduces this dose rate significantly. Workers in the room still receive small radiation doses, but these doses are generally on the scale of millirem per hour. Second, the water in the spent fuel pool keeps spent fuel assemblies at a safe temperature. You see, spent fuel still generates energy even though the reactor is turned off, and even after the fuel is completely removed from the reactor. A small fraction of this energy occurs due to fission, but the overwhelming majority of this energy occurs because of radioactive decay. Now, because the spent fuel's radioactivity exponentially decreases over time, this means that the heat it generates also decreases over time. A typical PWR assembly might generate on the order of 19 megawatts of energy when it is actually in the reactor and the reactor is turned on, but after about 1 week of shutdown, this lowers to about 19 kilowatts, a factor of 1,000 times less power. And after spending about 1 year in the spent fuel pool, this energy production decreases even further to roughly about 3.8 kilowatts of energy. Now, 19 kilowatts of energy is a decent amount of energy. It's roughly as much energy as a typical residential home furnace generates, and it has to go somewhere. Immersing the spent fuel in a pool of water allows the water to transport this heat away through natural circulation and keeps the fuel at a safe temperature. The water in spent fuel pools is also very highly purified, and this water is continuously monitored to see if any of the fuel assemblies are leaking radioactivity. So in summary, spent fuel pools are really an excellent place to keep spent fuel. The water in these pools blocks radiation emitted by the spent fuel, it keeps the spent fuel at a safe temperature, and the pools themselves are very durable structures. Spent fuel pools tend to be made out of reinforced concrete, and they have a stainless steel liner, and the walls in these pools are several feet thick, so they are fairly highly resilient to earthquakes or inclement weather. However, the one downside to spent fuel storage pools is that they are limited in how much spent fuel they can store. Most spent fuel pools have capacity to store about 10 to 20 reactor cores worth of spent fuel assemblies, and a reactor discharges 1 core's worth of spent fuel roughly every 4.5 years. The oldest operating nuclear power plant in the United States is about 55 years old, which means that the spent fuel pools at some of these older reactors are gradually filling up. Thankfully, there is another place we can store spent fuel once it has cooled off a bit. That is in dry cask storage. Dry cask storage casks are essentially large concrete casks that can hold cooler spent fuel assemblies. A group of spent fuel assemblies is placed and sealed inside of an airtight steel canister in these casks, which is surrounded by roughly 2 feet of concrete. Most casks have air vents that allow outside air to flow into the cask, but not into the sealed steel canister where the fuel is stored. And this natural circulation cools the canister and keeps the fuel at a safe temperature. Believe it or not, after cooling off in the spent fuel pool for about 5 to 10 years, spent fuel can actually remain at a safe temperature in these dry cask storage casks with just a little bit of airflow and without any water coolant at all. One of these casks would probably feel warm if you stood next to it, and each cask is designed to hold at most as much fuel as generates 19 kilowatts of energy. Again, this is about as much energy as a home furnace generates. Now let's define what we mean by a safe temperature. What is a safe temperature to store the fuel at? Now, this safe temperature is actually not defined by what temperature would make the fuel melt. That temperature is actually a lot higher than the temperature we store fuel at. But instead, a safe temperature is defined by the temperature which would allow the metallic zirconium fuel clad to oxidize. Zirconium begins to slowly oxidize when it is exposed to oxygen at temperatures above about 500 degrees Celsius, and it oxidizes very rapidly at temperatures above about 700 C. This oxidation process weakens the zirconium fuel cladding to the point where it will eventually fail and lose its structural integrity, and also this oxidation releases hydrogen gas, which is explosive. Because of this, we limit the temperature of spent fuel in fuel casks to about 400 degrees Celsius. Preventing zirconium oxidation is perhaps our main goal when storing spent fuel, at least in the short term. And this is both because we need the zirconium's structural integrity to hold the fuel, and also because stray hydrogen gas can accumulate in places and cause an explosion. This is exactly what happened during the Fukushima Daiichi accident. Fuel in the reactor cores of Units 1 and 3, and most likely fuel in the spent fuel pool for Unit 4, lost cooling for long enough time for the water to evaporate around this fuel and uncover the zirconium fuel clad. Without enough water to wet the zirconium fuel clad and keep it cool, the clad oxidized and released stray hydrogen gas. Nuclear power plants do have hydrogen catchers that gather any stray hydrogen and burn it off slowly to prevent explosions, but the magnitude 7.4 earthquake at Fukushima damaged these systems, allowing the hydrogen gas to accumulate and eventually explode. Eventually, the plant workers recooled the fuel and stopped the accident by pumping seawater into the reactors, which unfortunately ruined the reactors for any regular operation. Boiling water reactors require highly purified coolant water to avoid corrosion, and seawater contains minute amounts of dissolved minerals and other impurities. So pumping unpurified seawater into a boiling water reactor is kind of like pouring sugar into a gas tank. It just means that the reactor can't operate anymore after that. Now, getting back to dry cask storage. As I mentioned, the fuel in dry casks is placed inside of a sealed steel container in the middle of these casks and is passively cooled by natural airflow around this canister. And it is all surrounded by about 2 feet of concrete. The 2+ feet of concrete surrounding the spent fuel both protects the fuel from the outside environment and shields workers around the casks from any radiation released from the spent fuel. The radiation dose rates around these casks are at most about 25 millirems per hour on the surface of the cask, and at most 10 millirem per hour 2 meters away from the surface of the cask. These dose rates are fairly low, and the maximum allowed dose rate at the site boundary for a nuclear power plant is limited to 25 millirem per year, which is extremely low. The actual dose at the site boundary of a nuclear power plant is so close to zero that it is actually pretty hard to calculate. Calculating faraway dose rates is actually something that my research can and has been used for, and my old boss, Dr. John Wagner, a bigwig who is now the director of the Idaho National Laboratory, made his mark on our field by developing a super efficient algorithm for computing the radiation dose in far away or heavily shielded locations like these. In practice, the dose rate around these casks is so low that Constellation Energy, a utility that owns and operates about a quarter of the nuclear power plants in the United States, actually brings VIPs who are touring its nuclear power plants to eat lunch next to these spent fuel casks. Now, the 2 feet of concrete around these casks not just lowers the dose rate enough so that people can eat lunch next to these casks, but also protects the casks and the spent fuel inside from nearly any environmental hazard. And to go one step further, some sites, like the San Onofre nuclear generating station near San Diego, even stores their spent fuel storage casks just below ground level for even more protection. The spent fuel in these storage casks is continuously monitored to make sure that the fuel is not leaking any radioactivity and that nothing in the cask structure is failing or degrading over time. This monitoring includes things like visual inspections, pressure and temperature monitoring, using neutron scattering ultrasonic scans or robots to inspect the inside of the casks, and sampling gas in the sealed steel container to make sure that the fuel rods are not leaking out any gaseous fission products like xenon. And for all intents and purposes, we can keep our nuclear waste in dry cask storage almost indefinitely. The spent fuel stays at a safe temperature naturally, it is protected from any environmental hazards, and it is encased in a steel canister and concrete shielding that prevent the release of any radioactive material. There is really no immediate scientific argument against keeping spent fuel in dry cask storage. In fact, fuel is so safe in dry cask storage, it's actually hard to convince people to do something else with the nuclear waste. The fuel is fine staying where it is in dry casks, and doing anything else with the fuel is going to be more expensive than letting it sit right where it is, safe and cozy. There's only really one downside for keeping our spent fuel in dry cask storage at nuclear power plants. That is that you have to have someone at these sites maintaining and inspecting these casks, and that you still have to have security on site watching over the casks. These casks themselves are very, very heavy, but in theory, someone could steal a cask or the fuel inside a cask. These security costs can mount up when you consider that there are about 77 sites in the United States that store spent nuclear fuel. And even if the nuclear reactors at all these sites were to shut down and be completely decommissioned, you still need to pay people to guard these casks indefinitely. A more cost-effective option may be to bring all of these casks together and to consolidate all of our spent nuclear fuel in one centralized storage facility. Interim waste storage facilities propose to do just this, and companies like Holtec International have proposals out to build a site in places like Texas or New Mexico to consolidate and store all of our spent nuclear fuel. Now, these interim storage sites would not reprocess our waste, and they might not even remove the waste from their current dry casks, but they would instead keep all of our dry casks in one consolidated location until our government decides how to permanently dispose of nuclear waste. Holtec's proposed high-store consolidated interim storage facility in New Mexico would take these dry casks and store them just below ground level, much like how waste is stored at the San Onofre nuclear generating station. And it turns out that building an interim waste storage site might be very financially beneficial for the US government. Remember how in our very first video how I mentioned that the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 levied a tax on nuclear power to dispose of nuclear waste? Well, it turns out that utilities have been suing the US government successfully because the government is not taking possession of our nuclear waste and fulfilling their end of the bargain. Utilities have paid their waste tax, and they are suing the government to get this tax back. These lawsuits mount up to quite a bit of money. Utilities have sued the US government successfully for about $11.1 billion so far, and right now they force the government to pay about $740 million per year, roughly $2 million per day, to cover the utility expenses for storing nuclear waste. This is another reason why an interim waste storage facility makes sense. You can move all the waste into one location, pay for security to watch over the waste only at one location instead of across some 77 locations, and the US government can stop paying out billions of dollars for these lawsuits and fulfill its legal obligation to take possession of our spent nuclear fuel. Building an interim storage facility would probably cost somewhere between $2 and $5 billion, and Holtec estimates that their proposed facility would cost about $27 million annually to operate. $27 million a year is a much better deal than the $740 million per year that the US government is currently paying utilities for not taking possession of their waste. So why aren't we storing waste at an interim waste storage facility right now? First, as I mentioned before, using dry cask storage at nuclear power plants is just fine, and utilities are pretty much okay with holding on to their waste as long as they keep getting paid by the US government. So it is difficult to generate enough political will to make the change of moving waste to an interim storage site. The second reason is perhaps more interesting: even more lawsuits. In 2021, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission granted a license to Interim Storage Partners, or ISP, a joint venture of Waste Control Specialists and Orano, for a consolidated interim storage facility in Andrews County, Texas. The state of Texas sued the NRC in response to this license, and this lawsuit made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. In their lawsuit, Texas claims that an interim waste storage facility is technically a temporary waste storage facility, which is true. They also claim that federal law limits temporary waste storage to the immediate vicinity of nuclear power plants, which means that this waste should not be allowed off-site to be moved into an interim storage facility. They also claim that the Nuclear Waste Policy Act dictates that a permanent repository is the only intended option for the long-term storage of nuclear waste, which means that the NRC should not be allowed by the law to issue a license to a temporary interim waste storage facility. And lastly, Texas claims that licensing an interim storage facility is a significant national question and thus can and should only be done under the express direction of the U.S. Congress, which has not offered any direction on the matter. In addition to these official claims, the folks who raised this lawsuit are concerned about some other things, including first that a temporary waste storage facility could become a de facto permanent waste storage site. This is a fair concern because of how effective dry cask storage is. It would be quite easy and quite tempting to just leave waste in these dry casks at an interim site for the indefinite future. And next, they are also concerned about the safety of transporting waste to this site, which, if there was a significant accident, could disrupt the significant economic benefit of oil and gas activities in the Permian Basin. This is somewhat ironic, as transporting nuclear waste would be really safe, and these oil and gas activities currently release significantly more radioactivity into our environment in a completely uncontrolled way than transporting waste to these sites ever could. I plan to make a video in the near future showing why waste could be transported to these sites safely. So those are the claims in the lawsuit, and about 1 month ago, in June of 2025, the Supreme Court issued a decision dismissing Texas's lawsuit on procedural grounds. In short, the Supreme Court ruled that Texas did not qualify as an aggrieved party and had no standing to challenge the storage facility's license because they were neither the license applicant nor had they formally and successfully intervened in the licensing proceeding. The Supreme Court did not rule on whether the NRC had authority under the Atomic Energy Act or the Nuclear Waste Policy Act to issue a license for an interim storage facility, which in my mind was the most interesting question in the lawsuit. So anyway, this means that we can technically move forward on licensing an interim spent fuel storage facility, and maybe one of the proposed sites in Texas or New Mexico will ultimately move forward. My technical opinion is that building an interim storage facility would be a good idea, but the politics of such a facility are more ambiguous. Texas clearly has some objections against building a storage facility in their state, and New Mexico does too, having signed a law in 2023 that requires state consent for any radioactive waste storage or disposal. The sites in both of these states, Texas and New Mexico, have received a license from the NRC to build an interim storage facility, but the ultimate feasibility of these facilities will likely depend on public opinion in these states. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. As a scientist, it is frustrating knowing that these sites would be safe and watching them not move forward, but on the other hand, I also believe that we should only build facilities in communities with the consent of those communities. I hope that these videos might play some small role in educating communities on the benefits and potential risks of nuclear power and nuclear waste, and that we might someday arrive at some approach for disposing of nuclear waste that is both technically feasible and politically feasible. Until we reach that day, doing nothing with our nuclear waste is actually a pretty good plan. This concludes our video for the day and our mini-series on nuclear waste. I would like to close by thanking you for watching these videos, and to say that I hope that you enjoyed learning something about nuclear waste. Please feel free to comment below on how you think we should dispose of nuclear waste, and also on what video you would like to see next. Thanks again!